morning, third grade. Today we're going to be talking about the plot of a story. The plot is how a story is organized, or what order the story happens in. You can do the plot of a story for the whole story, or you can do plot of just a piece of the story, and that's what we are going to do today. The plot starts out with the exposition. It's where the author introduces the characters and setting. Then it climbs up our roller coaster and we have rising action. You can figure out the rising action by asking yourself, what is the character's motivation? What is the character's problem? What is the main conflict? You get up to the top and it's the climax. It's when everything is happening in the story. The problem is the biggest, everything is going on, everything seems to be happening at once. The falling action is when the story begins to slow down and the problem is starting to be resolved. It's not all the way resolved yet, but it's starting to be. When you get down here to the bottom of our roller coaster, it's the resolution. That's when the problem is solved or the conflict is resolved. It's when the character gets everything put back together. Good readers have to be able to identify the plot or the organization of a story so that they know what's happening in a story. When you're reading a story and things are happening, you have to be able to keep things in place and to remember what's happening, what event in each story is building on each other. Okay, so that's why good readers have to be able to tell what is the exposition, what's the rising action, what's the climax, what's the falling action, and what's the resolution. Today we're going to use a piece of Thank You, Mr. Faulkner, to kind of put a plot map or a roller coaster for our story in order. So remember, last week we had stopped because Trisha's grandma was walking with her in the field, and Trisha was saying how sad she was that she was struggling to learn to read. Trisha's grandma used to say that the stars were holes in the sky. They were the light of heaven coming from the other side, and she used to say that someday she would be on the other side where the light comes from. One evening they lay on the grass together and counted the lights from heaven. You know, her grandma said, all of us will go there someday. Hang on to the grass or you'll lift right off the ground and there you'll be. They laughed and both hung on to the grass. But it was not long after that night that her grandma must have let go of the grass because she went to where the lights were on the other side. And not long after that, Trisha's grandpa let go of the grass too. School seemed harder and harder now. Reading was just plain torture. When Sue Ellen read her page or Tommy Bob read his page, they read so easily that Trisha would watch the top of their heads to see if something was happening to their heads that wasn't happening to hers. And numbers were the hardest thing of all to read. She never added anything right. Line the numbers up before you add them, the teacher would say. But when Trisha tried, the numbers looked like a stack of blocks, wobbly and ready to fall. She knew she was just dumb. Then one day, her mother announced that she has gotten a teaching job in California, a long way from the family farm in Michigan. Even though her grandma and grandpa were gone, the little girl didn't want to move. Maybe, though, the teachers and kids in her new school wouldn't know how dumb she was. She and her mother and brother moved across the country in a two-tone 1949 Plymouth. It took 5 days. But at the new school, it was the same. When she tried to read, she stumbled over words. The cat, ran. She was reading like a baby in the 3rd grade. And when her teacher read along with them and called on Trisha for an answer, she gave the wrong answer every time. Hey, dummy, a boy called out to her on the playground. How come you are so dumb? Other kids stood near him and they laughed. Trisha could feel the tears burning in her eyes. How she longed to go back to her grandparents' farm in Michigan. Now Trisha wanted to go to school less and less. I have a sore throat, she'd say to her mother, or I have a stomach ache. She dreamed more and more and drew more and more, and she hated school. That's when Trisha started 5th grade. The school was all abuzz. There was a new teacher. He was tall and elegant. Everybody loved his striped coat and slick gray pants. He wore the neatest clothes. All the usual teacher's pets gathered around him. Stevie Joe and Alice Marie, Davy and Michael Lee. But right from the start, it didn't seem to matter to Mr. Faulkner which kids were the cutest or smartest or best at anything. Mr. Fokker would stand behind Tricia whenever she was drawing and whisper, "This is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Do you know how talented you are?" When he said this, even the kids who teased her would turn around in their seats and look at her drawings, but they still laughed whenever she gave a wrong answer. Then one day she had to stand up and read, which she hated. She was stumbling through a page in Charlotte's Web, and the page was going all fuzzy when the kids began to laugh out loud. Mr. Fokker, in his plaid jacket and his butterfly tie, said, "Stop! All of you are so perfect that you can look at another person and find fault with her?" That was the last day anyone laughed out loud or made fun of her. Okay, we're going to stop right there for just 1 minute. I want to come up here and I want to think about the beginning of our story. The beginning of our story that we read last week started out, and we said in the exposition, we're going to talk about the characters and the setting. So here's my map for Mr. Fokker. And I'm going to say that the characters were Tricia and the kids at school are the main character. I mean, there was other characters too, but those are the main ones that the story started out with. And then the setting was at school and at her farm. We're not making a pretty map, are we? Then the rising action, the problem, the thing that began to cause her to have to figure things out for herself. She wanted to learn how to read and she couldn't. So I'm going to write trouble reading. And I think the big conflict came, the climax came, when all the kids were making fun of her right before Mr. Faulkner stopped them. So I'm going to say kids picking on her. And she couldn't learn to read no matter how hard she tried. And I think right now in our story, we're kind of getting down. We're going to start the falling action. We're going to start to solve the problem, but we haven't got there yet. So far in our book, the kids and the Tricia are the main characters. They're at school and at her farm for the setting. The rising action, the conflict or the problem is that she's having trouble reading, and the climax is that all the kids are picking on her and she still can't learn to read. Okay, do you see how we thought through and we organized our thinking? I know it's not super beautiful, but you can just make quick maps like this for yourself if you're trying to keep track of a story. So, plot is organizing a story. We do the exposition, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and the resolution. And good readers know how to organize a story and keep track of the events that are happening in their mind. We'll see you next week.